Inequality is everywhere. It stifles ambition and potential. And when it becomes extreme, people can take to the streets. Ultimately, it damages economies and societies. The concept of human development is all about giving people freedom to decide who they want to be and how they'll live. It involves, among many other things, living a long, healthy life, receiving decent education, and having a decent standard of living. In 2019, Human Development Report studied inequalities in human development, revealing 5 important results. 1. Human development has progressed immensely. Far more people are reaching a minimum standard. There's less extreme poverty and hunger, and greater access to basic education. But progress still needs to be made. 2. Inequality is changing. 30 years ago, there was massive inequality in the most basic aspects of life. Many children didn't survive their first years or have any education. These gaps are closing rapidly, but new types of inequality are emerging fast, while richer populations have much greater access to university education and much better health at older ages. 3. Inequalities start before birth and can widen immensely by the time kids are in school. From then on, these inequalities can grow across lifetimes, driven by deep imbalances in political and economic power. This is evident, for example, in the relative positions of women and men in some countries. 4. We need new ways to measure new inequalities. Dollars and rupees won't always help us understand inequalities in health and education. We must go beyond averages to see the full picture. 5. We must act now to overcome inequalities and design policies that work for every age group. Giving kids early childhood education, for example, will last lifetimes. But governments shouldn't just tackle symptoms. Long-lasting solutions will come from addressing the root causes of inequality, often ingrained in a country's history and culture. That way, we can boost economic growth and reduce inequality at the same time. It's not too late to act.
Good morning, everyone. Excellence, colleagues, friends, welcome to the launch of the Human Development Report 2019 here in Sweden. My name is Hanna Nelson. I'll be guiding you through this event. I am a policy manager at Oxfam here in Sweden. I'm really happy to have the honor to be with you here today and to have these excellent speakers that you will be meeting shortly. I really hope you've had a strong cup of coffee and that you survived your walk through the rain this morning. I am really thrilled to see that UNDP has chosen to put inequalities at the center of this year's Human Development Report. I think, and many of us agree, that it is one of the greatest challenges of our time. Inequality, or rather, should I say, inequalities, as the report talks about. So it's almost 30 years since the first Human Development Report. And it still remains a powerful voice. I mean, all the seats are taken here today. There's a great interest. This report deals with inequalities in the 21st century. It looks at how it weakens social cohesion, how it hinders poverty eradication, how it damages people's trust in government, in institution, but also in each other. So the question that this report asks us and that I think that we should reflect on today is, why should we care about inequalities? Why is it important to go beyond income, as the report argues, when we talk about different types of inequalities? And what does a human development perspective bring to the conversations about inequality? And finally, of course, and that's why we're here, how can we tackle it together? The report tells us to go beyond income, beyond average, and beyond today when we talk about inequalities. It presents, I'm sure you've all read it, it's an easy read, ideas, but also policy options on how to tackle the drivers of inequality. And I think that one of the key messages is that inequalities are the symptom of an unfair system rather than the cause. So let's keep that in mind. A human development lens places people at the center of decision making. It is central to successfully tackling inequality. I'm convinced of that, and I know the UNDP is convinced of that. So this is a conversation that every society needs to have today. It's an issue everywhere around the world, and that's why we're here. So representing Oxfam here today, I'd also like to underline the urgency of tackling inequality if we want to be successful in the fight against poverty. We know that inequality is keeping people trapped in poverty today. And yet, let's also keep in mind, let's be optimists, but also remember that inequality is not inevitable. It is a political choice. So let's change the current trend. So we're really happy to have gathered here this morning for the launch of the report. The event is also live streamed. Hello, everyone watching online. And if you want to tweet, I know you do, please use the hashtag HDR2019. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first guest to the stage, the Minister for International Development Cooperation, Peter Eriksson. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Excellencies, Assistant Administrator Mourad Wahba, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I'm pleased to be here today at the launch of this year's Human Development Report, focusing on inequalities. A special thanks to the United Nations Development Programme and the Human Development Report Office who made this possible again. The world has come a long way since the 1990s when the first Human Development Report was launched in London. And so has the Human Development Report. It's getting thicker and thicker, I think, every year. I welcome the steps also taken by the UNDP to realign the report to be even more fit for purpose to address further challenges as the world continues to be reshaped. The theme of this year's report, Beyond Income, Beyond Averages, Beyond Today, touches the heart of the Swedish development policy, Agenda 2030, and the fundamental principles of leaving no one behind. I think the core message here is beyond averages. When you go and come out to the world, the countries that we are talking about, you see the difference is much bigger than you're supposed to see when you look at the averages and the statistics. The significant progress of living standards for people around the world in the 21st centuries must be acknowledged. It's, however, paradoxical that inequalities have simultaneously increased. This trend shows us that trickle-down economics has in fact failed to tackle the challenges of the 21st century. Effective political instruments are needed as serious challenges in addressing inequalities, including severe gender inequalities, remain. Around the world, women and girls are still systematically oppressed and discriminated against. The Swedish feminist government and the feminist foreign policy is a direct response to this situation. During the 2020, we will step up efforts to promote women and girls' economic and social empowerment and full enjoyment of human rights. We will increase our efforts for sexual and reproductive health and rights and enhance action on the women, peace and security agenda. Many challenges remain in providing access to education and health care, not least sexual and reproductive health and rights. The emphasis of Swedish support in this field is strengthening national education and healthcare systems to tackle inequalities from early childhood and throughout life. We support education as human right. This includes education in conflict and post-conflict situations. Effort for girls' education are especially needed. We have substantially increased also our support to the Global Partnership for Education. We are now also a major donor to Education Cannot Wait. Improving access to social protection is also a necessity for reducing poverty and inequality and improving gender equality. Sweden supports several social protection initiatives in, for example, Africa, such as Kenya, Mali, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. This is a relation between a strong democracy and reduced. There is a relation between a strong democracy and reduced inequalities. It's with great concern that we notice today how democratic principles are being challenged and how democracy is in decline in many places around the world, actually in most of the countries in the world. My government has made the promotion of democracy as a key priority in our foreign policy. Earlier this year, we launched a drive for democracy, and Sweden will stand up for democratic principles in all contexts, work to ensure that democracy, human rights, and rule of law is strengthened, and voice criticism against democratic deficits or risks of backsliding. We want to do this together with our partners, such as the UNDP. We need a strong United Nation, founded in democratic principles, human rights, and also rule of law, that is ready to address the root causes of inequities for those that today are left behind. With these words, I would now like to hand over to Mr. Mourad Wahba to provide us with a presentation of this year's Human Development Report. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I'm really happy to hear of Sweden's commitment to fighting inequality, to stand up for gender equality, and not least for the democratic principles that we find under threat around the world today. So thank you. I also noticed that Sweden gets a quite high ranking in the Human Development Index, at ranking number 8, but I think that we could do even better. So that's a challenge to you and your government. So now we finally have the pleasure of listening to the key findings of the report. So I'm really honored to warmly welcome Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, Assistant Administrator of UNDP, one more title, and Director of the Regional Bureau for the Arab States. Warmly welcome, Mr. Mourad Wahba.
Best of the UN. So, Hannah, I think perhaps before I start with there's a PowerPoint presentation and it's 10 slides. It's not too long, and I'm really going to try and make it quick. But before I start, first I'd like to thank you, Minister, for your introductory comments, and I'd like to thank you all for coming to listen to us, to share in this debate, because a report is a report. It's a conversation starter. What matters is what we do with the report afterwards, how we discuss it, how we think about development, whether it allows us to think differently about development, and whether it allows us to change policies in relation to development. And I hope I'll be able to sort of test some of these ideas with you as we go along. Before I also start, Hannah, when you introduced the first bit of this, right at the start, and you nearly said human rights, didn't you, before saying human development report. And I think you're right. It is about human rights. It's not just about development, and development must be about human rights if it is to succeed. And inequality is a question of rights also. In 1990, when we first started discussing the first Human Development Report, and I remember the thrill that we all had by somebody at last saying, money isn't everything. It's not about income. But it is about, and then sort of Amartya Sen developed it, capacities. It's about the capacity to live a long and healthy life. It's about the capacity to share in the knowledge that's produced around the world, to be educated. And it's about the capacity, yes, to earn a living, to participate in society. And I think 30 years later, the same questions are answered, and indeed Amartya Sen is giving us the answer. Because his first comment was, inequality of what? When you say it's about inequality, well, what? Inequality of what? And there are the clues in the title, of course. When you say beyond income, of course it's inequality beyond income, but it includes income. It's inequality, according to Sen, of capacities. And when he said that, when Amartya Sen said that, he said it in a text which is, I think should be required reading for everyone who's interested in development, which is Development as Freedom. Because essentially it's inequality of the chances that people have to live in a free and prosperous world. So I thought I'd just pick up on your thing, human rights, human development reports. I think they're the same, and I think you were right to go that way. One last comment, because my colleagues all prepare these slides, because it's a big office in UNDP, and we have a communications office. And there's one missing, I think. This is why I've started talking without the PowerPoint, so please forgive me again. The most important slide, I think, is on page 2 of your report. Actually, pages 1 and 2. Pages 2, you have 2 graphs. If you want to turn to them, then I promise I'll do the PowerPoint. And this is really it. But page 2, you have figure 1 and figure 2. For those who have the reports, for those who don't, well, there are copies somewhere. And if you look at figure 2 first, it tells you the real story. Just right there, it tells you what inequality means. In high human development countries, 1 child will die before the age of 17. In low human development countries, 17 will die before the age of 17, before the age of 20. 17 kids. Right there is inequality. I mean, you could start by inequality of being alive. It's pretty a good indicator of whether you're equal or not. And the second data point that it tells you is 80% of kids in low human development countries will not be in school, will not have real education. And I'm sure you have too, seen many of these schools where children sit and there's somebody who comes in on occasion, does a bit of teaching sometimes, and the kids comes out, they don't know how to read, they can't understand the text. And this is not just in low human development countries, it's in many schools in deprived areas. And I'm going to come to that later. And then the percentage of people in higher education, you can see, goes dramatically. 3 low human development countries, 55 high human development countries. That's your inequality. And the second figure, again, which is not in the PowerPoint presentation, so I have to do something about this in the future, is figure 1, which is, look, I mean, people are not dumb. They're saying this is wrong. And they're coming out in the streets, in Beirut, in Baghdad, in Bolivia, in Chile. They're coming out in the streets here, in Madrid. This is wrong. People see what's going on, and they're revolting against the set of inequalities. So that's why I was particularly pleased at this year's Human Development Report, and this is, I promise, is the end of my comments outside the PowerPoint. So now we can do this, if I can do it properly. So I presume. I'm discovering these slides like you. I'm not sure what happens next. Okay, here. Introductory slide. It tells us three things. If you're going to look at inequality through a human development lens, you're going to look beyond income. I think we've established that. You're going to look beyond averages. And that, I think, is perhaps a very interesting comment on our profession as development people. Because it's very easy to go for a quick summary of a country where we go there and say, all right, what's the average education level? What's the average income? Are they doing okay? They're not doing okay? And it's a quick measure. And to a very large extent, it's fine. But we've been looking beyond averages to look at what happens to human beings, not statistics. And what happens to human beings is that you get a bunching up. For those who like to look at graphs, you get a bunching up at both extremes of a graph. The very, very rich are getting richer. And this is, frankly, practically everywhere. It's not a phenomenon only of developed countries. It happens, I mean, I come from a developing country. Trust me, there are fortunes in my country that would rival anyone in the United States. I mean, the rich are getting richer, and they're bunching up on the right of the spectrum. On the left of a graph, if you can imagine a graph, there's going to be more and more poor whose share in income, whose share in education, etc., is getting less and less. So there's a bunching up. But on average, everyone's doing better. And so people like me who've had 30 years of development experience are saying, this is great, and we've done our job. Everyone's getting better. And to a certain extent, yeah, maybe it's true. Everyone is getting better, but these discrepancies exist. And it's getting better, it's not getting fairer, if I can go there. And beyond today, because we live in a very interesting moment for development practitioners. The ideals that shaped the 20th century, which was a reduction of poverty, if you can think of it like that, are getting realized. We've taken people out of poverty. Almost 1 billion people have come out of extreme poverty in the last 10 years. So the ideals of the 20th century are there. We need to do more. We need to take more people out of poverty. There's some backsliding. We need to make sure that people do not go hungry. There's still about 800 million people who go hungry, who are food insufficient. So we need to do better on the 20th century goals, which is when I started working. We need to make sure that the 21st century goals are also being met, which is the inequality comments that come up in the report. We need to make sure that there's a fairer distribution, that people have equal capacities, equal opportunities to live in their lives. And we need to look at the 22nd century, because the 22nd century is 8 years away, and we're going to start seeing elements of the 22nd century today. We've all been working on climate change. Climate change is for today, it's real, but it's also going to affect people who are born in this generation and who will live to see the 22nd century. What sort of lives will they have? Where will they have lives? And who? Will they have equality in terms of where they live, of their resistance to shocks, such as climate change, such as rising sea levels? And will they be able to take advantage of new technologies that are just now emerging? In terms of the machine learning, the artificial intelligence, will there be this sort of 22nd century where people can take advantage of what's happening and not suffer the consequences of what we in the 21st century are doing to them in terms of climate change? I think these again are the messages of the report. And then the rest of the slides is going to be an iteration of these messages. So please again forgive me if I go through them quite quickly, because by then I've probably taken too much time. I don't know. So population with primary education. And again, we're dividing the world into human development categories rather than income categories, because we're faithful to the early model that we started. Evidently, if you have double the people, practically everyone in very high human development countries has access to primary education. Less than half in low human development countries. And frankly, if you look at low and medium human development countries, and the distinction for me is very difficult to make. I think they're really one big block. But we just want to be polite and encourage some countries and tell them you're in medium human development rather than saying you're not doing well at all. It's a lot of people. It's about half the population. It is not there. Beyond that, however, you're getting new inequalities. These are basic, what I call the 20th century capacities. And there people are doing better. Early childhood survival, more children are living. More people are in primary education. More people have, we looked at entry-level technology, basically we said access to a cell phone. That was to a simple cell phone. And resilience to recurrent shocks was usually climate change, drought, or conflict. These are the shocks that affect people, and that can hit them from being in a sort of okay place to falling back into poverty. Disease in countries where there's no health system. So that's the basic, if you like, what I call the 20th century capacities. Enhanced capabilities, which is what we're measuring in this report. And I know these measures can be improved, we can do better, but we're trying to look beyond the basic capacities. So, do you have access to quality health, not just the basic, couple of vaccines when you're born and you're out? Do you have, when you say access to quality health, how can you measure age discrepancies, the survival rates at the age of 70, not 1 to 5? But what happens to people when they reach 70? How long will they live? And how many people will reach 70 is a good question. High quality education, both measured in terms of achievement and what capacities you gain from education, and not just whether you sit in a schoolroom when you're a kid. Do you go to university? Are the topics sort of important topics? Are there enough women who work in science, technology, and engineering and medicine in the STEM subjects? These are the capacities you can measure. Do you have access to present-day technologies? And again, present-day technologies is a very broad term, and people, what is an everyday, today technology? We try to measure it, we're saying just access to broadband. Because if you have fast internet, then you can, do lots of things, but you can also do some research. And are you resilient to unknown new shocks? What happens when sea levels rise? What happens when a new disease comes up? Will you have the healthcare? Or will it be, sorry, quickly? Cool. I mean, I really said what I wanted to say when I looked at graphs 1 and 2. So, but let me whiz through these. Again, iteration of what we've been saying. This is the growth pattern. These are growth rates, right? So, from 2007 to 2017, education access has been growing at 5%. Not so much in very high human development countries, because basically when you have everyone, there's not much higher you can go, you reach a ceiling. But look what happens when you get to university education, to tertiary education. Suddenly, people in high human development have a lot more access and have a lot more opportunity to get into education. Mobile and fixed broadband, I've just talked about, so boom, we go. Everyone is trying to get a cell phone. 1 in 2 people have a cell phone, and that really includes children who don't have cell phones. So practically everyone today has cell phones. How many people have access to broadband internet? And this, Michael, we had started to discuss yesterday. We had another event, and basically this is about what happens when you're born. When you're born, life's lottery gives you chances or doesn't give you chances. So right before you get into any development, into any market, in any professional life, where you're born, whether you have access to early childhood healthcare, whether you have access to preschool, which is very important, whether your parents are going to be able to afford to support you in education so that you can then get a job, so they can then enter a professional market and thrive, are all there. So, beyond averages, what do we need to do? We need to get much better at what we measure. And we need to get much more granular at what we measure. I'm just doing this. We look at values, not just income, not just average. We ask people, well, how do you see this? What do you think is happening around the world? If you look at it actually, and this is the sad thing to say, more people are becoming biased. Far more people are becoming biased. There's too much bias around the world. People are not seeing the reality. These are the more recent data, the darker blue circles. And this is bias regards, say, do you think women should be in politics? Do you think women can run businesses? And this bias is increasing, not decreasing. I'm going to skip this one because I just talked about it, it's about being in the market. And the last one is on the climate crisis. Again, lowest ecological footprint obviously are going to be in low human development countries because there's less use of carbon, for instance, just right there. While the ecological footprint is growing, also the use of water is growing. And so, as we hope that GDP grows, we're going to see a reduction in greenhouse gases. This one I've talked about, which is on the new technologies, the access to new technologies. I'm skipping now very quickly, right? So, okay. Sweden. The weights on Sweden, because I knew people would ask about it, and I think you alluded to it, Minister. Number 8, and one of the most equal countries in the world. There's more details in the report, and I would encourage you to look at the tables, because one reason why this report is long, also, Minister, is that we've gone beyond our usual set of tables and looking at data gaps and really interrogating how we measure things. So we say there needs to be a revolution in metrics. We're trying to show where that revolution metrics could go. So again, for those of you who are interested in data sets, there's lots to look at. There's some distinction, some inequality in health according to income status, basically socioeconomic status. If you're richer, you can afford better medical health care, even in Sweden. And that's one of the most equal countries in the world. There's a small increase, which is what I've been saying, in gender bias here, but everywhere, not just in Sweden. A smaller increase in Sweden, I think, and some of the Scandinavian countries, but much larger in other areas. And story of everyone that everyone knows, that's in the papers, the rich are getting richer. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? And that's how I'm going to end, so 3 minutes? 2 minutes? 2 minutes. What do we do about it? The report looks at policy options. And the most immediate policy option, the one that gets in the press every time, is tax. Right? Tax the rich, tax the rich. And that's one option. But if you stop there, because we believe it's not about income only, we're not going to get very far. Yes, I mean, the state needs money in order to have fairer social services. But it's not only about taxing rich. It's not only about taxing multinational companies or the internet-based companies, the Googles of this world you've seen the debate around France. It's also about taking an active role in supporting the human capacities of people, and that's how it ends, because we come back to human development. It's also about supporting more people to access higher education and to access quality higher education. It's also about supporting women to access STEM subjects. It's also about improving healthcare, not only in early childhood, but throughout life. And with that, I think I can end. So,
thank you. Thank you so much. Actually, you can stay up here because you're just going to be joined soon. But yeah, thank you for sharing your messages. I think you did a fabulous job in summarizing this quite heavy report, this thick report. I think my key takeaways that you're really saying that I think is really, really strong is that inequalities is really depriving people of their freedom and their human rights. So it's serious business. We can't accept it. I also think that you did an excellent job in describing the old inequalities that many of us know about, that we as Oxfam often talk about, the economic inequalities, but also at least getting me curious on the new inequalities. We talked about the climate change-driven ones, the technology-driven ones. So thank you for that. I think that we will continue this conversation. You asked for us to not just read the report, but to have a conversation. So I would like to bring up the other excellent experts that we have here on stage. So Mourad, if you'd like to take a seat over there on that brown chair. We will then have Susanna Gable, Chief Economist at SIDA, Victor Gallas, Deputy Director, Stockholm Resilience Center, Stockholm University, and Fredrik Wettermark, Head of Policy and Public Affairs, Norrsken Foundation. Should we give them a round of applause? Well, thank you all for being part of this launch. I've been waiting to get you up on stage. So for those of you who just joined us, so that is not you because we just heard your view, but what stood out to you when you listened to Mourad's presentations? Were there any surprises or anything that you really reacted to? I'd like to hear your initial thoughts. So maybe, Susanna, we can start with you.
Well, thank you. First of all, congratulations to a report that I think is excellent, and it will be not only interesting for us at SIDA to read, but also very, very useful. So at SIDA, and I believe many of you, we are interested in seeing this fantastic poverty reduction that we've seen the last couple of decades continue and become sustainable, right? And also that it reduces the poverty in the last 10% that remains. And for this to be sustainable, you need growth that is not only growth in the sense of doing more what you're already are doing, but you need growth that goes from low productivity jobs to high productivity jobs. So economic growth with economic transformation. So you can have growth that hits a glass ceiling, and obviously that is not going to translate into poverty reduction. You can also have growth that has economic transformation, but you don't have any poverty reduction. So for the economic transformation then to lead to poverty reduction, it's exactly these enhanced capabilities that are needed. So I think the report is a fantastic addition, kind of pushing the inequality discussion towards those type of inequalities. It's also important to talk about them now because we need a sense of urgency. So you have inequality of income that is more of a symptom of these enhanced inequalities. And it's more of a flow variable, if you would like, a return from these capabilities. And the capabilities is more like a stock variable, so it accumulates year to year. But that also means that if we do have distortions in these type of inequalities, it will go on and give marks way into the future. So we need to address them now so that we don't, in the future, have an extremely expensive change to make. So I think it's crucial to focus on these inequalities in enhanced capabilities for sustainable poverty reduction, to ensure we don't waste human resources in our countries, and to ensure that we don't set up an economic system that is extremely expensive to fix post.
Thank you. Victor, what stood out to you?
So I have three main reflections, but I think first of all, I would like to acknowledge the fact that social inequality and climate change are so closely interrelated. I think that comes out very clear from the report. And as a Swede with background in Chile that was forced to cancel the host of COP, it just becomes so clear. So it's a very timely report in that regard. So just three short reflections. First of all, I think what we need to realize is that we're not just facing climate change. I think we're facing planetary change. So it's not just that it's getting warmer or that we're seeing more weather events. Actually, many, many key systems in the Earth system are changing. The forests, oceans, biodiversity, something called the cryosphere, etc. And that will have social implications and drive new inequalities. I think that's one great study by Rashid Sumaila, for example. He's an economist, and he shows that as a result of climate change, marine species will migrate from the tropical zones to north and south. That is a massive redistribution of resources from the global south to the global north just by this planetary change. And I think those are the kinds of inequalities that we will be seeing in the future, and they are unprecedented. We haven't seen that before at this scale. The other thing that I think is very important that we need to realize is that phase of planetary change is in the short term unavoidable. Even though in an ideal world we will manage to cut down emissions, the planet will be changing anyway, just because of what we have emitted so far. And that forces us to think about climate adaptation and climate resilience in a very serious way. Like, how do we tackle that in a very strategic and clever way? And I mean, there is some positive sides to this. I mean, there was something called the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change. And what they noted is that tackling climate change could be the greatest global health opportunity of the 21st century. So one of the best climate resilience, climate adaptations options that we have is actually investments in health infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And that would also help bridge social inequalities in a very clear way. So I think that's just one of many examples where climate resilience will address climate inequality at the same time. The third point, and I was thinking about this reading the Human Development Report, is that we in the Science and Policy and Civil Society Committee, we need to speak with one voice. And by that I mean is that there are several other reports that are very important in this domain. So we have the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees. We have the IPBS, Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and their assessment of the threats to biodiversity. How do we make these two key reports from science, climate, biodiversity, the Earth system, connect to human development report and questions about social inequality? I don't see them merging in the way that they need to be if we're able to create an agenda that is truly transformative. So building climate resilience and tackle social inequality at the same time. To me, those three key things. It's planetary change, it's happening now, and there are ways that we need to bring these things together to tackle both the climate crisis and social inequality at the same time. To me, is just very important.
Thank you. And I think that I was personally also very happy to see that climate and inequality was one of the chapters of this report, and that it's really a conversation that we're having. We've been having that as Oxfam for a while. We've been talking about climate inequality, and we really need to bring these together. And I think most of us in the panel are wearing this pin also, and we know that that's indeed what the 2030 agenda is trying to do and trying to help us to do. But we can do it more. So thank you. Carl Fredrik, what are your thoughts?
Well, I actually had a long list of 7 points, not 3, but I'm going to try to compress them. I just wanted to start by thanking UNDP for a very good report. I'm here representing some kind of mix between, I guess, private sector innovation. I do have a background at the ministry, but right now I'm working on tech innovation. And I think that a big important takeaway from this report is that it has a very balanced view on the role of technology. We either tend to go with the positives and the negatives, or take technological development as a given. But I think what this report shows is that there's politics in it, there's policy, and it's not disconnected from policy. There's no law of nature that says that technology needs to develop in a particular way. But I do see that we have a long way to go in actually bridging that gap. I think that one interesting takeaway from the report is that the inequalities in, I think, what's called here enhanced capacities essentially reflect what's been a discussion for quite some time within the, I think, the development community, but also other parts of the UN, concerning what used to be called the digital divide. And this was a conversation that was started, I think, in the mid-2000s. It continued through the World Summit of the Information Society conferences, and it has been, an important agenda point on the UN for some time. I think that it is both encouraging but also worrying to see that we are now seeing the digital divide in effect. That is to say that there were actually warnings that this technological divide would happen, but perhaps that did not translate into policy quickly enough. But the discussion in itself isn't actually new. What's needed now is probably to make that discussion more concrete and making policy recommendations based on it. There are a lot of challenges around making that. I've crossed over from public sector to private sector, and I can see a pretty big divide between the two. There are few institutions, forums, platforms that are able to connect these two different worlds. And at the same time, we also have a very fragmented global policy discussion on tech. This is very much similar to what's happening in Manifors, but for tech, which hasn't really had a single framework, which hasn't had a single UN institution in charge, which has a very distributed, multi-stakeholder form of governance, the fragmentation in that policy sphere globally will risk leading to isolation and to some countries perhaps lagging behind and not being able to take advantage of all the opportunities that actually technology, or a truly global technology, would offer. But there are also huge opportunities. I think that right now we're seeing a huge wave of innovation, of possibilities, of a young generation in developing countries getting tremendous access to tools that were previously the remit of people living here or in the US. It is not, I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that, a teenager in Uganda, she will have the same capacity to develop the same artificial intelligence platforms and the same machine learning tools that NASA is using on the same platforms. There is no difference. And that is the great equalizer right now. We're seeing a huge wave of this innovation. We're seeing startup hubs, we're seeing hope, we're seeing people solving problems locally. But that is also being combined with increased flows of capital. Now, there is obviously an opportunity in that too, because much of this increased previously so-called ESG flows of capital is now becoming more of an SDG flow of capital.
Could you explain what ESG flows of capital
Well,
is?
ESG was the kind of broad capital agreement around do good capital that was started by Kofi Annan in 2004, I think, in the Global Compact. That was the early days of good capital, if you will. What we're seeing now is a trend towards more and more capital using the SDGs as a framework for measuring the results. Now, we're still in a very crude and early days of doing this, and many of the things that we're discussing here today when it comes to technology are not incorporated in these frameworks for private sector. So, for instance, in concrete terms, when capital flows to a low-income market and innovation is created, that innovation is not necessarily guided by policy recommendations on what would actually be the development benefits. So that's a great challenge.
Thank you. Thank you for framing, I think, the challenges and the opportunities with technology in either deepening inequalities or helping us fight it. I think it's really quite exciting, and we'll get back to you on that, because I know you have a lot to say on that topic. But I wanted to get back to you, Mourad. You touched upon it when you went off your PowerPoint presentation. I'm sure you'll get in trouble for that later. But why should we care about inequalities? What importance do you think that this report can have for policymakers? How do we take it from a report to actual policy change?
It's a good question, and thank you. Why should we care? Well, we care because first, it's the job we're in, right? I mean, but we really care, I think, for three reasons. The first is, by having stark inequalities in capacities, we're missing out on a lot. The people who are not, for instance, in education or in higher education are not going to contribute to society to the extent that they could have contributed had they had this capacity afforded to them. So we're missing a lot. In fact, the report calculates that the cost of inequality is about 20% of where we could be. If it were more equal, we'd be 20% better off. And 20% is a lot. I mean, so that's one element. I think because we're missing out on a lot. We're missing out on capacities. We're missing out on people's contributions. Let me take limits on that. The more extreme case of inequality is exclusion. But it's not that you're not as well as, say, the 10th percentile in the population. It's that you're out of the counting entirely. In areas where, for instance, women are excluded completely from the labor market, you're missing a lot on productivity, just on basic hard economics. When we're missing, when we exclude LGBT communities from the mainstream of our lives, we're missing something. So extreme cases of inequality show us really why we need to focus on inequality. The second reason, I think, is that inequality has now become an issue of social conflict. And, you know, as part of my job, I saw lots of versions of this report before it came out. And my first comment to Pedro Conceição, to the conceiver of the report and to the head of the team that wrote the report was, you know, you keep mentioning Chile all the time. Why? I mean, why are you just so focused on Chile? And you'll see there's a lot of mentions of Chile in the report. And this was before the events in Santiago. So I think inequality is also a predictor of social conflict. And then later open conflict. And perhaps the third reason is that, you know, there's a value system in the world. And I think perhaps if I were to critique my presentation, if I were to critique also the report, it doesn't talk enough about values. But, you know, we all share some basic values around the world about a fairer world. Otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here, any of us. And inequality just goes against these basic values. And even us who are not living in deprivation, you say, find it wrong that there is such an unequal world.
Thank you. Yeah. Susanna, as a chief economist, it would maybe make sense for me to ask you something on economic inequality. But to challenge you, I would like to broaden it a bit. The redistribution of income, which is something that often dominates the policy debate on inequality, is sometimes seen as a silver bullet that will solve everything. I'm not saying that it won't, and it doesn't matter, quite the opposite. But I'm still curious to hear from SIDA's perspective. How does SIDA work to create a long-lasting change in both income and the broader range of inequalities that we've discussed this morning in human development?
This is like my favorite topic.
Oh, good. So you're getting excited.
Your time keeping skills will be tested. No, but when we look at sustainable, inclusive economic development within SIDA, we try to look at people living in poverty as economic actors with potential. And this is not to say that everyone can be involved, but we just assume that the majority of the poor, they want to contribute to growth and they want to benefit from growth by contributing. So it also connects to other types of poverty: hope, dignity, freedom, empowerment, and control over your income. And I think even when people talk about Sweden or the Nordic countries in general, they think about inequality in terms of income too, but that's just a fraction of it. And Sweden is a tiny, open country and has always been, and as such, you're under this constant pressure of economic transformation. So we have no other choice than to create a system where we constantly manage this economic transformation and make sure that people get back into the economy. And you can see that all over our economic system, that we have created all these ways of that to happen. And it could be everything from childcare to employment support, to the close collaboration we have between businesses, the government and workers, and so on. So it's important to take those lessons, not copy them to our partner countries, but to try and build on that, so that we work on inequalities I like how the report talks about the pre-market programs you can have in market and then post-market to ensure that in the end we have inequality of resources.
Thank you. I'll move on to you, Carl, Fredrik, because I could see that you had a lot to say, so here's your chance. So there is clearly a growing concern regarding technological change. There's optimism, but there are also fears. And a lot of that focuses also on how this technological change will reshape the labor market. How automation and artificial intelligence will basically replace humans that are performing tasks today. There are also large gaps in countries' abilities to harness these opportunities, as has been said this morning, which might, if we don't act now, have implications on inequality and human development. So, how do we ensure that the gains from innovation and technology are distributed in a way that leads to reducing inequalities rather than enhancing them? And you touched upon it earlier.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, it's a very, obviously it's this incredibly interesting and crucial question of our times. What will happen with AI? What will the consequences be for our labor markets? What will happen? And it's a discussion that, is happening here, it's happening in Europe, the US, it's happening, of course, to a lesser extent, I would say, in low and middle income countries. There is more of a discussion about technology access and getting access to this technology rather than actually perhaps addressing it or drawing up policy around it. Now, the boring answer around AI is, of course, that we just don't know. depending on your worldview and personal preferences, you can find any number of reports stating that AI will replace all jobs or AI will replace no jobs. But I think that a key thing to remember here is that some of the measurements that we are using to describe the blockages of low and middle income countries to access to technology are not very accurate. So for instance, I would argue that the AI revolution might actually be much closer than those numbers actually indicate. Because to some extent, you could argue that the lack of broadband access would create something of a shielding wall towards the incoming AI revolution. Well, today that's not really how it works. Even somebody with a $20 cell phone, Indian-made Kaio's cell phone, can access many cloud services that are essentially, that have exactly the same capacity as any cloud service, any AI service here in Sweden. So there is a great equalizer in terms of access to technology that is happening now. Now, the problem is that policy is not keeping up with that. And policy in AI needs to be much, much faster and more iterative. So we have a big problem in keeping up with that here, because there's no such thing as a way to generally regulate AI. That would be like generally regulating the internet or electricity. What you will be dealing with are instances where AI will affect different sectors, and they will affect them differently. But the speed with which this is happening is immense, because AI is also self-reinforcing technology that improves itself over time. So I think that closing the gap between policy and tech and innovation and those driving this development, especially when we're talking about policy that
would
will
you say that would require some collaboration then?
Yes,
because
yes, definitely.
I work in policy, and simply tech sometimes scares me. I have very few techie friends. So how what I'm hearing is that you see a gap between the ones making the policies and the ones that know.
And there's always been such a gap. I mean, that gap has always existed. It's always existed in Sweden. It's existed elsewhere. There are rare platforms that are actually able to create meaningful joint conversations around tech and policy. But the need for those kinds of conversations is just going to increase, because otherwise we're going to kind of end up in a climate situation. We will then be talking about AI mitigation in a few years' time. We're talking about AI resilience. And that is not where we want to go. We want to make sure that the opportunities that are there to use these technologies to provide financial inclusion, or provide healthcare, or provide increased delivery of services, and thereby strengthening, willingness to pay tax and all these other mechanisms. Those are the ones we want to reach. But that is not going to just happen it's not just going to happen on its own. And this is, I think, my main concern, is that there are a couple of forces happening at the same time now. You have democratization of innovation technology, increased capital flows, a new generation, both here and in low and middle income countries, that are able and willing to use technology to do good. But there is not really that connect when it comes to policy making, nor actually, I would say, data. This is also an area where we need, much, much better data. Access to mobile and access to broadband doesn't fully capture how much the technological developments will shape development in the coming years. And I think that it will probably be faster than we think.
Thank you. So more policy that can keep up with the change, the fast change, more data, and I think that UNDP is also a good actor to facilitate many of these conversations, and I'm sure it's keeping you busy. So you said, which kind of got my heart to stop for a while, that if we don't do something about technology now, we will find ourselves in a crisis similar to the climate crisis that we are in now. I don't know if we have the energy for that, so I think it's really clear that we got to fix this one before it's too late. But speaking of climate crisis, Victor, I know you know a lot about that. I mean, we see the impressive global movements taking place currently. It's not very often led by young people, including in our own country. We've heard also that the climate is very interlinked with inequalities. So when, speaking of policies then, when creating policies to address climate change, should the dimension of inequality be included? And if so, how? You can guess what I think, but how? How do we do it? How do we do it right?
I mean, yes, it's a no-brainer. But then, now, can I say something on technology too?
Of
Because
course,
I think it's
yes.
related, and I don't know whether you agree
Yes.
with me. The thing is that the tech sector, and in general, when we talk about technology in this domain, I mean, the tech sector is great at innovation, but terrible at distribution. I mean, we've seen that all the time. And I think we're underestimating the power of nature-based solutions that we would need, like restoring ecosystems, restoring forests, agricultural landscapes, etc. That is not really, I mean, you can use new tech for that, but it needs to just acknowledge the importance of the biosphere and what we do. Now, in that transition or in that change, I think when we talk about climate policies and social inequalities, there are at least two dimensions. One of them related to mitigation. Mitigation requires a transition in our economic systems and in what we do, like new energy systems, new food production systems. We need to make sure that that transition is just, making sure that people don't feel left behind. I think that it's a terrible scenario where we actually just move into the climate domain and just ignore social implications of that shift in terms of job losses, etc. But it's a great opportunity as well to give people, to create new jobs, to boost health systems and restore people's sense of dignity. That is a term in the report that I like very, very much in that regard. In terms of adaptation, so that's not mitigation, there are massive, massive opportunities to build in a dimension to deal with social inequality. I mentioned health already, nature-based solutions, food systems, food security, social welfare. All of these things have a capacity to help us build climate resilience and will address social inequality at the same time. I think what we need to avoid at this stage is to have a climate agenda that is perceived as being an elite project. That is very, very dangerous. I mean, just to throw this out like a provocative term, like Tesla environmentalism. Like we need to avoid to focus so much on technical solutions that are actually just affordable to small part of the world. And so if we talk about tech, if we talk about climate adaptation, focus on the people where we need to bridge and deal with social inequality first and use technology to do that.
Thank you. That's very clear. I know you wanted to make a comment as well.
On technology, I think that the technology is there. I think you're saying, and I think I agree with you, broadband isn't perhaps the best measurement of access to modern technology, but there are limitations to access. First of all, not all areas, and especially I'm thinking of Africa, is covered by, say, satellite broadband. So there's just physically, you may have a $20 cell phone, although $20 is a lot of money, but you may have a $20 cell phone, but you can't actually reach the cloud in many areas. Or it takes a long time to do it, or it costs money because you're going through cell phone towers that are costing a fortune. The second thing is capacity. I mean, there's a basic capacity, you can just dial on a cell phone, which is what my capacity is, or get your instant messages. Or you can work at it on platforms that are similar to those in NASA, but then you have to have the educational access to get to that. And that, again, is an issue of capacities. That's an issue of availability of education and cost of education. And the third, because we shouldn't neglect, is permission. There are countries where access to the internet is limited, and is limited by policy, by government policy, for instance. There are sites that are closed, where you can't access, or by the market. I mean, I've been in countries where I can't use WhatsApp to make voice calls. Not because you're trying to keep us ignorant of the rest of the world, but because the phone companies are saying, no, we need some income also. So there's a whole set of policy changes that is required and that needs to be looked at. That's on one level. Having said that, I've seen amazing work by young people in the worst situations. I've seen people in Somalia who are developing apps and who are using them. And it's not about, some kids doing startups. It's about finding back your dignity, having been a recipient of aid, that you can now join the world sort of progress and create an app that is used everywhere. And finally, perhaps on a comment on productivity. And to go back to Victor's comments.
I'm going to ask you to be just a little brief.
Yeah, I know, I talk too much.
Yeah, because you had so many minutes, but it's very interesting. But
it's how do you measure productivity of somebody working, say, to restore a rainforest, to find a nature-based solution, broadly? Because how is then there's a market failure in there, and how do you work on that in order, precisely, to make sure that there is a move from low productivity to high productivity, but in areas that serve a much broader area and that's not captured by the market.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, thank you. I know you have a very brief reaction to that.
Yeah, just very brief on the technology track. I obviously agree with both of you in detail, but I think that you're absolutely right in distribution. For us, our organization is working now to build innovation spaces elsewhere. We're just opening up in East Africa now. And the access to networks, to capital and capacity is, of course, absolutely important, the most important thing. That being said, there's a hope there because access to capacity and has actually never been easier now. There is an inherent possibility in technology to actually also gain capacity once access is there. So I think those are hopeful signs. But as you also touched on, the policy issue, the risk of segmentation of the global internet, of breaking down in different tech spheres with different development, also very much connected to the human rights aspect of having an access. That is a huge problem, and we lack those global institutions that can actually discuss those issues.
I think that this perfectly sums up the challenges, the opportunities, and the risk of inequalities, but also the possibilities with technologies. I think it's a good summary of that. So I know that the audience might have some questions soon, but before they do, I wanted to give you all a chance to, in let's say 2 sentences, say from your end, what are the most important strategies if you got to decide to implement to tackle inequality? And Susanna, I'd like to hear from you first.
Well, I'll say 2 sentences that connects also, I think, to this technology debate. I think for any constraints you see to an equal development, you need to be not only country specific, but you also need to be specific to the group you want to see included. So even with technology as being one constraint, you need to look at it from the perspective of different groups and those groups in different countries, and the solutions will look very differently in different contexts.
Thank you. So very much on the point on also looking beyond averages and
Absolutely.
making sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Victor.
I think we're looking for the interface of solutions that manage to help us mitigate the climate crisis, that helps us adapt to it or build resilience to it, and that help us bridge social inequalities at the same time. I think that should be the sweet spot that we aim for. And there are a couple of interesting examples, but making that work and scale it in a way that it truly has an impact is very, very difficult. But I think that's what we need to aim.
Do you think we can do it?
Of course.
Okay, good. Carl Fredrik.
Well, trying to sum it up, I think that one key thing for, at least for us, and I think for the broader global tech community, will be to try to create the access to capital, the access to networks, and the access to capacity that will allow people to use a tired tech phrase, but disrupt inequalities rather than actually create them. And I think local innovation is going to play a key part in that.
Thank you. And finally, Mourad.
You're going to tempt me with a short
sentence.
You
get your last 2 sentences here, but I'm sure people will have questions for you and the rest. What would you?
Recognizing inequalities will lead to better development policy. It's quick and short.
Quick,
I know,
short, recognizing it. Great, excellent, thank you. So, dear audience, I'm sure you have questions. There are two runners with microphones. I'll take one question at a time, one up here front. Please state your name and your organization if you have one, and then a question.
My name is Minna Eriksson, and I work at a Swedish NGO, the Economist, and I work there as an advisor for conflict and justice. And my question is, I keep on saying in my reports that one of the important factors for inequality if people live in conflict or not. And as far as I can see, this has not been discussed, and I've been trying to look through the report as well, and I don't find any heading. So my question is, of course, am I right or am I wrong? Is that I keep on saying that there is a concentration of poverty to context where there is violent conflict, and that's where the inequalities are increasing a lot, and that this trend is expected to continue as well. I read statements like that. That's my question. Thank you.
So I think it would be fair to give that question to you, Mourad. Is she right or is she wrong? Is inequalities and conflict connected?
Also, yes, absolutely. I mean, my other job is to work as director of the Bureau for Arab States in UNDP. And believe me, conflicts are us. So I do a lot of work in conflict areas. Certainly, conflict is a result of inequality, but also produces further inequality. Conflict is a result of inequality of access, both to natural resources, but also to justice systems, for instance, to opportunities in education, but breeds also inequality. And I'll just go very quickly, right? Because you have differential sort of ethnic groups who have differential treatment by the state, different religious groups have different treatment. Men and women have different treatment in a conflict. So all sorts of groups tend to be affected differently through conflict, some much more than others. And so conflict tends to be a result of inequality, but also a producer of inequality. I can give examples, but you'll stop me.
Any of our other panelists that would like to add? Susanna?
Just to expand on those two sentences, I think it's what we see is certainly poverty concentrating to fragile countries, and many of those being in conflict, but also fragile in other types of dimensions. And again, we need to for poverty reduction in the future, we need to first identify who is poor. And then how they are poor, in what dimensions. It's not only income and resources, there are many others, security, and you can go on and on. And then you need to look at then why they are poor and how to solve it. And instead of having this more general approach to it, which we have mainly been talking about here, you should look at each of these constraints from the perspective of the group that you are trying to support. So to capture those in conflict, it's important that we have a much better picture of the situation they are in and the challenges they have. Huge challenge in terms of data there, and then look at each of the constraints from their perspective to ensure that they are included in a sustainable poverty reduction.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question. What about this side of the room? No questions? Nope. Yep, here. Top second row from the front. And just your name and your question, please.
Uno Svedin, Stockholm Resilience Center. It is, of course, here in Stockholm this week, not anyone, I guess, not knowing that a Nobel Prize has been delivered. or several Nobel Prize. Let's take the economic side and take the home take message from that part of this year's Nobel Prizes. What was the take-home message? The take-home message was that in environmental and societal development type of frames, you have to zoom in on the details rather than sort of having the averages, as is on in this report, as a target. So why don't you take now and see if you can use this year's economic Nobel Prize to the memory of Alfred Nobel and use it and fling it on and look at this report. So what does it say and what doesn't it say?
Okay, and is the question directed at any one of the panelists, or is it more a wish for UNDP and the rest of us maybe to bring that perspective in? Yeah, any of the panelists who'd like to comment on it? Yeah, Susanna, you are.
I feel like I've
ready.
been talking too much, but
No, it's
no.
great.
But I think first of all that the Nobel Prize is hugely appreciated and have fantastic messages on looking at these details for the reason of being able to say that what exactly it is that produces results. But none of the Nobel Prize winners would say this is the only way to understand development and the only method that we should use. So it's one method that has been extremely helpful for us to understand inequalities and poverty reduction and so on. And we should continue down that path together with other ways of understanding more systematic changes in our societies.
Carl Fredrik.
Well, just briefly I think a takeaway for private sector on the Dufour findings is the importance of experimentation, really. The importance of close to market innovation, really trying to understand the local problems, innovating, seeing what works, what doesn't, and then scaling. And, that model is kind of also how many, I would say, innovative companies, startups, are using, that's the model they are using, looking for those types of evidence. So there's a lot of crossover here, and I think that could probably be explored much further.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, maybe there in the third row for front. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Bushra. I'm from Yemen, Swedish Yemeni. I was sitting in the launching of the report of the UNDP, the impact of war on Yemen, on development, as a previous World Bank and USAID worker. I'm happy to hear that you have bringing in inequality, because that was the main issue I discussed with about the report. There are three things, and I would like to also see it in the report. The G/I coefficient, because when conflict happens, there is a new wealth distribution happens, and there are new war economy that develops. So this is happening now in Yemen, for example, and the G/I coefficient is the largest in the world. It's 0.9. So this is a very important figure to understand the conflict as well, to understand what is going on. This is one aspect. The second aspect is education. Access to education is one aspect, but what type of education those people are getting? There is an important thing that we need to take care of. The education system that the people are having that now in Yemen is about hate. It's about creating a new generation of bombs, of a geopolitics position of Yemen that will create a significant economic crisis and solving problems for everyone in the world. So this is very important. What I feel frustrated about is that these important, simple, specific things are not focused. Supremacy is one of the issues. This is one of the issues that brought in a conflict as well. So this is important, that we should have more pressure on bringing in equality, not supremacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that powerful statement. I'm sure anyone would like to react or add to that.
And just not to defend the report, because I don't like to do that, but I think there's quite a long bit of text on the Gini coefficient, on impacts of measurement, on what we mean by the Lorenz curve, the tile measure, on the Kuznets measures, etc., of just on income inequality specifically in the report. So it'll be there. We try to limit it because we try to have a balance between having a very academic report and having one that speaks much more, sort of to spark a debate, not necessarily among academics, but among sort of a broader range of populations. So there's this balance we try to have. But it's there somewhere. There's a couple of pages in there, and then there's an annex where it looks at measurement issues. I completely agree with you on education. I've worked on the impact of war report in Yemen also. Just on Yemen specifically, we're working on sort of solutions. What happens after the war? How can we rebuild? What are the areas that we need to look at as we go back from a war situation? We return to a situation of saved normalcy. And that goes perhaps to the gentleman's comment also. I think this report is too long. It's also not long enough. It says a lot, but it doesn't sort of go deeper into issues that you raise or that say the Nobel
Perhaps
Prize.
this ties back to where you started, and what we can see in this room, that this report is supposed to start conversations, and that it's supposed to stir up an appetite for us to discuss the challenges and not least the solutions, right? I think you can say that you then succeeded with what you hope to achieve with the report, and also looking at all the hands looking to ask questions and add to this. So maybe you've succeeded with that.
There's a report and then there's life.
Yeah,
and then you have
life,
to try
exactly.
and decide how they work.
Yeah, there's also a time for a seminar that unfortunately eventually starts coming to an end, even though you don't feel like you've heard all the views you wanted to hear from the audience and not least from the experts. But I think that we're going to soon wrap it up. So I wanted to thank the panelists, to thank Mourad, Susanna, Victor, and Carl Fredrik for really interesting remarks and for a really engaging conversation. I'd like to continue it for hours, and I'm sure there were many that would like to. We are not going to thank you with flowers and chocolate because it's a sustainable event, but we'll thank you with a really warm applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, and before I let you go, I will steal a few minutes just to leave you with some final words to tie it up. I think that we've all seen that the demonstrations that have been sweeping across the world is a clear sign that for all our incredible progress that we have made and should be happy of, something is not right in our globalized society and economy. There's something that's not working. From Oxfam's side, we believe that the rules are indeed skewed for the rich. We see that many people are being left behind and are also feeling that they're being left behind. From Oxfam's side, we'd like to say that maybe rather than being left behind, they're actually being actively pushed behind by the current economic system and practices. So it can be changed. Oxfam data, and you talked about the extreme inequalities, shows that 8 men, all men, own more than the bottom half of the world's population, so about 3.5 billion people. That's a shocking fact that really sits with you. We can't deny that the inequalities are there. Whatever the inequalities that matters most to you, I think it's becoming really clear that it's bringing people onto the streets. As civil society, we are, of course, happy to see people being in the streets, but it's also a reason for concern. And we see that it's either the cost of train tickets. In Sweden, it was the price of petrol or a discussion on increasing that, or political demands for independence. But a connecting thread, and I think that's really clear, is this rising and this deep frustration with inequalities that you've all touched upon today. So I think, and UNDP also wants us to feel that we should indeed celebrate this remarkable progress that has enabled so many people to higher standards of human development. We should recognize that. But we need to also recognize that these policies and practices have led to successes that are just insufficient. At the same time, people's aspirations, and not least the young generation, is changing. So looking today, ahead of today, as the report asked us to do, asks us then to tackle different forms of inequalities. So as much as we want to look at economic inequalities, so Susanna and I and many others, we've also heard from our speakers on other inequalities, including on human development, such as health, education, and not least climate and technology. So we think that there is no silver bullet, frankly, to address inequalities. And sorry if you were hoping to get that solution at the event today. But I think that what we haven't been discussing so much, and that what we're taking from here, is that new inequalities that we can't ignore, either because we've almost already ran out of time, as with climate change, or we might run out of time, as with technology. We need to bring them into the conversation. From Oxfam's side, of course, I'd like to also stress that we can't stop the fight against gender inequality that is also persistent in all countries in the world. It's very happy to hear our minister's commitment as a feminist government. So in sum, there's still time to act, but the clock is ticking. The Human Development Report 2019, I think, is very impressive and will feed many global conversations, and it contributes to presenting facts. But I think that the main message that I take away is that we need political action. And we can't be afraid of that. Political action may carry a political risk, but history really shows us that the risk of inaction is far greater than the one when it comes to inequalities. So, and again, we see that inequalities keep trapping people in poverty, which is something that I know that all of us in the room are working hard to fight. So again, thank you for attending this Human Development Report launch event here in Sweden. Thank you to the United Nations Development Program for putting this on and for hosting these conversations. Please feel free to grab a light version of the report on your way out, and also you can also find it online. Thanks so much for attending, and thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you.